We'll now start our first session on representation, and I want to introduce Carol Burns, who's here. I'm going to let you say who you are. I won't take up that time, but I just do want to say thank you again, and then you can actually introduce quickly the panelists of your group. But anyway, thank you for taking this on.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Peggy and Brian, for inviting me and us all to launch the conference today. It's a delight to be here. I'll say a few words, and I think I'll do all the introductions at the beginning, just to allow this pace of the visuals to then dominate. I'll get used to the mic. I wanted to say first about myself that I've been involved with the Women's Leadership Summits, which have been national events sponsored by the AIA, but instigated by a group of women principals in Boston, beginning in 2009, which have happened every other year. And there'll be one in this year, 2015, in Seattle, the fourth one. It's going to be, to put in a plug, September 17th, 18th, and 19th. I consider myself to be involved in ongoing national conversations about the status of women in architecture, and I consider this event to be part of that. For myself, I'm an architect. My firm is Taylor & Burns Architects in Boston. We're coming of age because we are 20 or 21 years old in practice. We set a milestone last year with $17.5 million in construction during the fall semester. I think in semesters because I've been involved with teaching my whole life since completing my master's degree at Yale, and I've been affiliated for the last 5 years with Wentworth Institute in Boston. So I'll do the introductions in the order that presentations will be made. The first is a slideshow that Peggy will help us through by Karen Burns and Justine Clark of Parlour Video, who, because they're in Australia, are not here in person and couldn't be Skyped in, it seems. They're both co-founders of the Parlour movement, I'll call it, because it's much more than a website. And their website talks about expanding the spaces for women in Australian architecture. I consider that modest, as I believe they are helping to contribute to expand to the space for women in architecture around the globe. The second presentation will be by Gabrielle Esperdy, who's an associate professor of architecture at the New Jersey Institute of Technology. Gabrielle, I'm just meeting everyone, so we'll put names and faces for everyone here. The next presentation is Marta Rodriguez. Correct. And Marta is assistant professor at the University of Houston, dynamic. Carla, Corroto, and Lucinda, Kaukas, Havenhand. Here. There we go. We should have all met earlier. Carla's a professor of sociology at Radford University, and Linda is associate professor at the College of Visual and Performing Arts at Syracuse University. Then Suzanne Frasier, associate professor at Morgan State University School of Architecture and Planning. Suzanne lived in India for a year as a 2012-13 Fulbright scholar and research fellow affiliated with the School of Planning and Architecture in New Delhi. Laurie Brown, associate professor at Syracuse University School of Architecture and co-founder and co-leader of Architects since 2012. And Ingalill, Wahlross-Ritter, Woodbury University affiliate in the graduate chair in Los Angeles and director of the Woo-Ho Gallery. So that's the sequence that will make the presentations today. And Peggy, Brian, thank you so much.
So I'm going to speak in two voices, Karen and Justine's, and we'll see if this timing, Pechakuka, is going to work. So we think of academia as a site. Like all sites, its borders are porous and its territory is fluid. Different actors flow across its borders. The boundary between academia and the industry, in quotes, is an imbricated, not a separate one. Industry actors teach in studio, professional practice, and construction. But academia marshals knowledge into subspecializations such as professional practice. Our women students are already on both sides of the border. Even if they are not yet working in practice, they are immersed in practice knowledge and ideologies through online and offline activities. Knowledge workers in academia have privileged access to speaking platforms. At Parlour, we have shifted the focus from representation to advocacy. We ask, how can we all use our privilege to advocate and create a space for others to speak? We have a responsibility to the women students we currently train and those we have already trained. A platform like Parlour creates a space for many voices: student, academic, practice director, new graduate, ex-architect, architecture parent, Australian, New Yorker. In this space, the borders between university and the world are porous. Knowledge transfers occur backwards and forwards between university and the industry, and vice versa. As historians, theorists, and editors, the Parlour Project asks us to step outside the boundaries of our established research and work practices. We are challenged to think about workplace practice in the industry of architecture, to rethink our established methodologies, and to work to report in accessible ways on multiple platforms the findings and analytical sense of our research on women in the contemporary Australian architectural practice workplace. Before arriving at architecture school, our students have come through largely meritorious educational systems in a media landscape that until the last 2 years presented feminism as a historical project. Architectural feminist analysis can be siloed in history and theory courses. It's a challenge to academic feminists to move across to work in and analyze the industry sector and to report back through student-accessible sites away from the refereed journal system. Parlour present voices from the industry collected through online surveys, the ex-architects, the marginalized, those with media footprints, and those without. Our students may not believe us if we talk about discrimination, but they find the voices from the profession compelling. We need to find ways for our students to access these stories from the workplace frontline, rather than merely conveying in concert with mainstream architectural media the success stories from women who may, for complex reasons, choose to conceal any discrimination experienced. This has meant stepping into intellectual territory we have not previously articulated. As academics and writers, it means reconceptualizing the topics of feminism so that the moment of pay negotiation or part-time hours is analyzed, and we formulate concrete strategies for acting in the space of the workplace negotiation. It means making these moments knowledge topics for our students. The workplace is almost invisible in architectural history, except through heroic stories of invention. Our Parlour guides, concrete guides for how to act in key workplace moments, were researched and written through a dialogic process of extensive industry consultation. Feminism involves the exchange of stories. Many of our students begin to work in industry whilst they are studying. They already participate in both worlds. We need to offer them methodologies and strategies for conceptualizing what they may see or experience as individual and personal moments, but we can also be understood within larger structural patterns. This project has challenged us to use a variety of research methodologies. In some ways, the project is old school liberal feminist, working with rational statistics, policy approach to lead change, and yet it retains the post-structuralist core, working with an archive of oral texts and sometimes emotionally raw voices that remind us of women's differences from each other. Our project has involved a number of fora, including a large public workshop attended by students and local international industry professionals. Once again, students heard voices from the front line, and we took commonplace experience and made it a topic for analysis. Our students want to hear us talk about careers, career journeys, and the workplace. Workshops offer a space outside studio for analysis of the industry and workplace.
Okay. In Delirious New York, Koolhaas observed that the problem with manifestos is their inherent lack of evidence, which is why his manifesto was retroactive. In Complexity and Contradiction, Venturi claimed his gentle manifesto was only indirectly polemical, as it separated the true from the false in modernist discourse. In the Scum Manifesto, Valerie Solanas proclaimed the only path left for civic-minded, responsible, thrill-seeking women was to overthrow existing regimes. What follows is based on a mountain range of evidence. It is decidedly untidily polemical. It is a challenge to the status quo of publicity, promotion, and performance in contemporary architecture culture. We are separated from these scraps of print media by 2 and 4 decades, but they remain up to date. Though we've given up the online anonymity suggested by the New Yorker cartoon, in its opportunities for curating and aggregating content, the digital realm still offers possibilities for critical self-representation in our engagement with architecture's public, allowing us potentially to transcend the lookism mocked in the public service advertisement. This is essential because of the way sexism continues to operate overtly and covertly in vicious tweets, in malicious Wikipedia editing, or in inappropriate encounters, old-fashioned and face-to-face, with peers and subordinates. Speaking at the AIA's centennial in 1957, actress Lillian Gish chided architects for acting like Victorians, who believed the only time a woman's name should be in print was when she was born, married, and died. The only architects Gish knew of were Stanford White, because he got shot, and Frank Lloyd Wright, because he was unabashed about publicity. We may recoil at the idea of personal branding and self-promotion, but producing an undeniable body of work is not sufficient for success and recognition, given the enormity of historical, institutionalized, and casual discrimination women in architecture face. Gish, by the way, thought architects should sign their buildings. Few of us are as lucky as Gertrude Stein in having someone like Alice B. Toklas to nurture our genius during our life and cultivate our legacy after our death. Archivist, curator, custodian, cook, Alice was all of these things. She may be in the background of these Cecil Beaton photographs, but she should be in the foreground of how we think not only about relationships that will support us professionally, but also how important it is to control the narrative in order to tell our own stories in our own ways about the work we've done in architecture. Le Corbusier grasped the power of media. Architecture was an art, but it was also communication. To communicate effectively in an age of mass consumption, architecture had to be reducible to digestible bits. Hence his fascination with the language of advertising, which he deployed to produce memorable objets types, including his own architectural persona. His glasses, like his buildings, embodied the essential overplus: functional, recognizable, memorable. The meaning of Corbusier's maison bonnet frames may be mutable, but their symbolic power is fixed, which is why they've been adopted by so many acolytes. We need not copy his glasses today, but we do well to heed their message: icons endure. McKim and White achieved the architectural trifecta: financial success, professional respect, civic regard. White was the temperamental artist, McKim the consummate professional, but the universal acclaim of their prolific practice was due in large measure to Mr. Mead, the pragmatic businessman running the office, managing dozens of designers and hundreds of draftsmen, trying unsuccessfully to keep Stanny out of scandal. There are ways to achieve architectural immortality besides actually designing buildings, and being a name partner helps. But what Mead really taught his partners is that architecture, as built reality, is never the product of one set of hands. When it was established in 1975, the Office for Metropolitan Architecture offered important lessons about de-emphasizing the individual. Its name didn't name any designers, including, alas, 2 women who were founders. But this underscored the true collaborative nature of practice. OMA also implied an interest in moving beyond singular buildings towards the metropolitan landscape as a whole, while the publication of SMLXL in 1995 put to rest what little remained of those lingering ideals. They offer an object lesson. Big buildings by big architects do not a metropolis make. Architecture is also in the aggregate and infill, in small interventions that make a big contribution to our qualitative sense of place. Quality of place was key to Jane Jacobs' analysis of modern urbanism, and while it's easy to be cynical about her sidewalk ballet in this luxury inequality era, she wrote one of the most influential books on cities, period. What does the death and life of great American cities have to do with representation? Though Jacobs was a professional journalist for more than a decade when she published the book, she was treated with snide condescension because she was a woman. Banham called her a lady critic, and Mumford in The New Yorker dismissed her as an uninformed amateur, an urban quack. Note the cartoon down here. How's that for editorial irony? So this is the woman behind a man, the cartoon says. There is no historical evidence that Eileen Gray was Wonder Woman's alter ego, but I wish there were. We pretend to live in an age when canons don't matter, embracing inclusiveness instead of masters of form, but Starchitect celebrity profiles and annual architecture school lecture series tell a different series. A well-known designer once proclaimed that architects carry the utopian gene, and maybe that's the problem, spending too much time trying to make the world perfect instead of making it better. Arch villains mess with perfection and hog the spotlight, stoking overheated egos. Superheroes, like most women, do the job and slip off into the shadows, an heroic ideal worthy of all architects. Louise Bethune joined the AIA in 1886. Julia Morgan entered the École in 1899. But into the 70s, the status of women in architecture was so abysmal, it required a convention resolution to get the profession's attention. Yet in that heady decade, with new pedagogical models on offer, with Denise Scott Brown calling out sexism and the star system, change seemed inevitable. And that's why we are here again, 40 years later, to finish that work, optimistic about architecture's future. So let me end with a rhetorical flourish and perhaps a rallying cry: feminism, fuck yeah.
Charlotte Perriand and Kazuyo Sejima, 2 architects that used the role of new women to start their careers in France in 1920s and in Japan in 1980s, 2 decades of economic splendor, industrial changes, and social revolutions in favor of a more egalitarian societies, which demanded novelty and experimentation in architecture that started with the conception of furniture. Both women took advantage of contests of female dynamism for the very beginning of their professional trajectories, having recognition in the mainstream media even before being hired by Le Corbusier and Toyo Ito. In the 1920s, Le Corbusier proposed a revolution in the design of domestic In the 1920s, Le Corbusier proposed a revolution in the design of domestic space, dwelling machines and equipment instead of homes and furniture. The chaise lounge was a critical icon from this period. Toyo Ito started the 1980s designing architecture for the era of deliberation. In his PAO 1, the house disappeared into a zone of intelligent furniture. The experimental approach, their lightness, capacity of movement, and multifunctionality made the Cheslon and Pauwam precursors of a new architectural spatial paradigm conflating residence, machine, and furniture that I call petite architecture. Perian and Sejima were in charge of the design of the Cheslon and Pauwam. Both were responsible of the tactile, material, and sensual qualities of those pieces. In turn, the sensuality of their creations was amplified by introducing their own image, transforming a leisure machine and an intelligent furniture into objects of desire. While in Japan, I discovered that Toyo Ito created a fictional character named Adele, who was inspired by Perian, a French lady who frequented cafes with her sketchbook. It was through Adele that Ito created Pauwam, and Sejima will personate Adele. Petit used tangible material conditions that invoke a sense of eroticism. It is an optimistic and seductive architecture thanks to its corporeity and form. In spite of its simplicity, Petit is far from minimalistic. It is closer to Baroque. Petit prototypes are objects of desire, like jewels, precious, select, and finally detailed. Indeed, the anthropomorphic character of Perian and Sejima's Petit projects denotes inspiration from furniture design as well as Burroughs' techniques of tailoring from fashion design that makes their architecture adapted to the human body. Petit is furniture architecture that incorporates technology to satisfy human needs, explore the formal and technical potential of novel materials and techniques from other industries, which makes it more efficient and sustainable. The inclusion of sophisticated technology gives Petit its autonomy and provides the necessary comfort to its inhabitants. In summary, Petit is architecture that pampers the scale, is demountable and therefore temporary, experiments with materials and techniques, and is conceived for the informal type of life associated with enjoyment. Petit explores the relationships between designing a house, a piece of furniture, a machine, or a dress, between architecture, technological industrial design, and decorative arts. Petit architecture is a luxe device for any place, any time. Japan inspired the concept of petit, a culture that values the small as well as functional beauty. Indeed, in petit architecture, the qualities of impermanence of the traditional Japanese house, a piece of furniture itself, converge with aspirations for luxury associated with French decorative arts. When furniture expands and it is technologically equipped to a point where it becomes inhabitable by a group of people, providing its occupants with sensorial comfort, it is petit architecture. Petit is architecture that pampers the scale, no excess, lacks nothing. It combines the capacity of assembly and disassembly of furniture with the kinesthetic and tactile potential of fashion. Architecture can be called petit when it remains with specific limits of dimension, time, energy, economy, material consumptions, and environmental impacts. With technical precision and luxury, the search for pleasure of the Cheslon and Pauwam anticipate the nomadic tendency in France and in Japan to enjoy weekend excursions. Architects and industry in both places began to think about vacation homes for a mobile life. Perian and Sejima start their own careers designing weekend houses, experimenting with form and materials that cause their demountable architecture to stand out. Their trajectories converge on what I call petit architecture, defined as habitable technological furniture for enjoyment, leisure time. Perian's life of art resurfaced in the 80s in Japan as a niche of inspiration for the creation of furniture and architecture. The sketch was screened in an apartment in Paris on a dim winter's day. A strong desire for dazzling sun and fresh air must have occupied Adele's mind. My imagination was a street. Did she know about Le Corbusier? These words, written by Toyo Ito, reveal an uncovered story that connects Sejima and Perian through a fictional character named Adele. Perian and Sejima were both precursors to designing objects for themselves, tailored to their own bodies, as well as promoting them using their own image. The main contribution of both designers to the architectural discourse has been the material and tactile focus as well as the sensual potential of their work, which is derived from their interest in integrating furniture, sophisticated technology with architecture. Perriand and Sejima's Petite architecture embodies a complex duality where concepts such as a Japanese temporality converge with aspirations for luxury.
Okay, with reverence, humility, and appreciation, we borrow from Audre Lorde's essay, "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House." The subtitle, "A Structural Polemic," poses an argument about form as we problematize ideology underpinning the patriarchal culture of architectural education in which most of us were socialized. Ours is a brief analysis of the social structures of power relations, the matrix of oppression that weave our identities and affects us differently depending upon context.
The theme of this session is representation. Excuse me. We assume this meant women's equal access to prestige through having one's design, writing, or research acknowledged, to be invited in the same way some men in architecture are included. We would like to take issue with the general category of women in the title, Women in Architecture, because based on social class, race, ethnicity, nationality, physical ability, age, sexual identity, and so on, all of our experiences in architecture are quite different. A woman teaching architecture at a public university in Mississippi has a significantly different experience from a woman teaching at Yale. Excuse me. Yeah. Women's studies demonstrates the first step in developing a feminist perspective is to rewrite a discipline's history and include women. Architectural history now recognizes the work of Margaret MacDonald, Julia Morgan, and Eileen Gray. What happens after we rewrite history? Celebrate Women's History Month? A telltale sign that this strategy is incomplete is that people with dominant status are still comfortable in their unchallenged worldview. Rewriting individual women into the history of a discipline is not enough to lead to structural changes, and it often reinforces the dominant paradigm. I think we all agree that there is a missing feminist revolution in architecture.
And to date, feminism in architecture has taken two paths. One is a post-structural academic feminism that investigates theory at a textual level, legitimizing feminism by being an acceptable architectural discourse. The other is the conservative liberal feminism, the apolitical ideology pushing women's ability to achieve equality through our own choices. The goal of liberal feminism is equal access measured in quantitative forms, proportions of women winning FAIA status, a woman becoming a dean or partner, gaining access to her firm's C-suite. To get a woman to the top of the architectural pyramid means there is still a disenfranchised labor force at the bottom of that pyramid.
While post-structural feminism theorizes about architecture and liberal feminism is concerned with equal recognition for awards like the Pritzker Prize, the very foundation of the profession remains unexamined. Feminists have made important contributions to architecture, but we have yet to transform the basic conceptual frameworks of the field. A comparison of architecture with disciplines which have been more deeply transformed suggests factors that may facilitate or inhibit feminist paradigm shifts. As Audre Lorde cautions, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So we respectfully ask the question here, is the traditional architectural marker of success that advocates for women's exposure in reviews, lectures, exhibitions, the proper tool to push the design profession away from its inherent elitist and patriarchal moorings? In the same way, feminists who champion intersectional analysis, the recognition that race, ethnicity, social class, and gender form a matrix of oppression for some and privilege others, have critiqued the women's movement. We must take a look at architecture and ask bigger questions than how we can get a handful of women included.
So how do we explain the dearth of men and women of color in architecture schools? Why do so few working class and first-generation college students graduate with degrees in architecture? Why do so many women leave the practice? Where once the prime objects of academic feminist critique were the phallocentric narratives of our male-dominated discipline, now feminist criticism has turned to its own narratives, finding them reductionist, totalizing, inadequately nuanced, valorizing of gender difference, unconsciously racist, and certainly elitist. There is something to be learned from this.
From that perspective, the same ethos that frames architecture as competitive for exhibits, lectures, and participation in evaluative reviews, and where students are juried rather than educated, also creates competition between women rather than cooperation among us. Audre Lorde wrote that, quote, interdependency between women is a way to a freedom which allows the I to be, not in order to be used, but in order to be creative. Today, we are gently critical of what we see as the neoliberal project of individualization of feminism in architecture.
So we ask, rather than adopting the master's tools, what are the appropriate methods to bring about the radical change in architecture, not only for women, but for all underrepresented people? Perhaps we start by problematizing the tyranny of design studio that creates false hierarchies of assessment based on ineffective, outmoded, and exclusionary categories of value. Studio, where the students are expected to be consumed with architecture at the expense of other epistemologies, at the expense of family, friends, or knowledge of current events. Feminist rethinking has to challenge how we make knowledge claims in architecture, which still privilege those who speak the loudest and have the most exposure. Architecture, we know, should be diverse and plural. We can all agree with that. To end with a quote from Audre Lorde, for the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. And this fact is only threatening to those women who still define the master's house as their only means of support. Thank you.
Thanks for having me here. In the past 2 decades, the built environment curriculum has seen remarkably rapid growth, has become increasingly interdisciplinary and critical, and increasingly demanding by the addition of computer-aided design, sustainable building technologies, and a broader cultural consideration of design and construction precedents. However, despite the advances we've made, our delivery of design education, our production of design researchers, and our expanded definitions of who is a designer have not kept pace. There is a growing call to transform architecture education with the intent of producing not just trained future architects, but students who are socially responsive and interested actors ready to face and energetically contribute to alleviating the full spectrum of challenges facing global societies. With this current scenario in mind, key questions come to fore. How can we be agents of change in helping to build capacity for educational transformation? How can we focus on the use of advanced pedagogy to produce engaged and empowered students capable of taking action to address socially crucial and environmentally critical local and global challenges? As we question such large and overarching issues, it is imperative that self-retrospection occurs. When considering revision or replacement of the existing status quo, including the underrepresented demographics such as racial minorities makes the effort essential and undeniable. I teach at an architecture school at a historically Black university. A large number of the students are first-generation college attendees, no less first-generation architects. How can minority students be deprived of the right of passage of the traditional architectural academic trajectory, that being earning the accredited college degree, pursuing the professional internship, taking and passing the architect registration exam, and then hanging out their professional shingle? Is it appropriate to launch minority designers in training immediately into non-standard status when they are already de facto outsiders? What is our pedagogical responsibility, our professional responsibility? Is it ethical to allow that licensure is not a necessity when professionalism has been chronically withheld by societal and academic structures? The current trend for alternative careers for the architecture profession is suspect, unless everyone, including the status quo, are operating as alternative with a capital A. Otherwise, such efforts to serve to further marginalize minorities. I've also been a visiting faculty member at the School of Planning and Architecture in New Delhi for the past 6 years. The SPA is India's premier school of architecture, and it's ranked 7th in all of Asia. The South Asian architectural curriculum is enmeshed with post-independence Indian architects' relationship with European aesthetic traditions and trends. How the North American and West European Architectural Academy is representative, the makeup of its members, and the product it manifests becomes more critical when examined through these lenses. I'd like to pause for a moment for some self-examination for the Academy. Who has the authority to alter the establishment, possibly obfuscating or even eliminating the traditional paths to professional legitimization for minorities and chronically underrepresented demographics in the Academy and the profession? Only when the current elites have unanimously adopted the alternative attitudes and practices will minorities too be counted as the norm. This is an interesting query. How can we collectively foster time, space, and experience where underrepresented designers in training have the opportunity to conceptualize, have the right to abstraction, to critique, and have the privilege to resonate theories within an updated and indeed an unlearned status? And once we do so, then do we lose our exalted status, our eliteness? And would that be a bad thing? I recently participated in a conference where the eminent scholar Gayatri Spivak spoke of unlearning privilege. It riveted me. Spivak described her own experience to unlearn her own privilege and to recognize her position within the structures in place that foster privilege and access and awards and support and preservation and perpetuation. And here she also emphasized her own situation as a minority, as a scholar, and a feminist, which only further serves to accentuate her chronic classification as an outsider. The invitation to participate in this seminar provides a compelling opportunity for us to heed Spivak's call to unlearn our privilege. I'm quoting here, "There are diminishing returns from the continuing study of entrenched topics." And here I'm quoting Nicholas Christakis of the Yale Institute of Network Science. And repeatedly observing these phenomena does not help us fix them. Focusing on the invitation of interdisciplinary topics will bring about new ways to accelerate the adoption of desirable practices. In every architecture degree program, the faculty are so busy tending to the requirements of the profession, those being the NAB criteria for accreditation, that considering the issue of feminism in architecture, inclusion and alteration of the standard can seem like an indulgence. The generalist paradigm of architecture lends our field to a myriad of practical discoveries about fundamental problems, but can we fix ourselves? The profession of architecture has an admirable track record of interdisciplinary innovations and accomplishments. And I'll just close by talking about Amartya Sen's recent work on the development, the quality of life, and freedom when he proposes human capabilities approach. He considers how these ideas relate specifically to education and argues that participatory action research might be a methodology for implementing and evaluating capabilities in education as a way of doing fairness and equality in education. Nurturing underrepresented in their efforts to accomplish the architectural academic trajectory and fostering an architecture profession that is flexible in its definition via the elimination of a standard is our pedagogical and our professional responsibility. And I'll just take a second to remind, probably I'm preaching to the choir, but there's only 327 African American female architects in the United States of America. Thanks for indulging me.
So I'm going to be presenting some data that I've been collecting for the last 3 years, looking at who are the invited lecturers in schools of architecture in the U.S. in their primary series. And this stems from a book, my first edited book, Feminist Practices, where I was really interested in trying to bring awareness to a new generation of up-and-coming and emerging practitioners, designers, and thinkers. And this is also in connection with Jeremy Till's 30% pledge, where he argues that no one should agree to a lecture in a school unless there's 30% of women already a part of that lecture series. So the data that I'm going to be showing you is going to first stem from schools that have no women whatsoever as part of their lecture series. And I want to note that this is an ongoing project. The data is not entirely complete. So what you're seeing is the beginning of the analysis. But so the number of schools we've been able to contact is bracketed on the right. So you'll see for no women whatsoever, it varies from 12 to 28% across the U.S. And like I said, it's not entirely complete. Where it starts to get interesting is the next slide, where we go from 0 to 1 woman. And it exponentially increases 3 to 4 times. Which was rather shocking. We didn't realize that that would be the case, that just by adding 1 woman to the lecture series, you're going to increase the statistics so greatly, which is, quite disturbing when you think about it's just 1 person you're adding. Then one of the things we started to look at is how can we further start to analyze this data, and we began, and it'll come up in just a second, we began by looking at how the ACSA determines our regions. And so we were interested in looking at, well, where are the better regions, in hopes, which is not happening, to be able to point fingers or to see are there patterns emerging. And I don't think I've collected enough data yet to actually be able to do that. But where you see the East Central region has the most women of the 6 semesters I've been collecting, and then the Mid-Atlantic has the second best second best invitation to women. But then what we began to find is that it's quite erratic. So these schools may be best, but then they also may be some of the worst. So where the regional zeros, where there are no women invited, the Gulf region is the winner with 3 out of the 6 semesters. And then second to that is the Mid-Atlantic. So although they had some strong semesters, they also have some very weak semesters. And then the East Central as well factors into having a semester with no women whatsoever. So it started to make us think, well, is there any reason to do this to begin with? But I think there is, and I think to start to understand who's leading our schools, what our demographics are, helps us understand where there are vast problems. So when we start to look at who's leading our schools, to expand upon some of the numbers that were presented in the introduction, out of 152 programs, we have 23 female deans, which is about 15%. But if you combine that with directors, heads, and chairs, we have 50 women in leadership positions in the U.S. And so I want to point out the Gulf Coast, which had the least number of women invited, is very low, not the lowest, but one of the lower regions with women in leadership positions. But then the East Central, which has the least number of women, had the most number of invited lecturers for the semesters we've been gathering. So it was interesting to see the disparities between where women are in positions of power or leadership and where they're not. And then compared to who our faculty are. So overall, we have 30% of female faculty across the U.S., and not surprisingly, the faculty are still very white and still very male, although I did not include race. I did have that from the NAAB. And where you see more women is not surprisingly in the lower ranks, sadly, and clearly we have to do a much better effort of hiring, promoting women all the way through. But I think it's important to understand who are teaching our students, who are leading the schools, and then looking at who our students are. So in the next slide, we have almost, not quite, 50% of our female students on average, and then 42% are, that is way cut off, but 42% are being awarded degrees. So it's not quite 50%, but we're getting there. I know at Syracuse, at my school, there have been years where we have far more female students entering in the freshman year. So this is just average numbers. So one of the things I've been very actively involved in is the organization I co-founded with Nina Friedman, Architects. And we've begun a program called University Hubs, where we're reaching out to right now all of the accredited programs in New York State to create a brown bag lecture series to bring up and coming women who are not recognized or who are undiscovered into their schools to talk to them about the work they're doing. And what's critical about this effort is that it's run by the students. We are just helping facilitate. We think it's incredibly important that they have a role and agency in who they want to come speak to their school, and hopes that these people will then migrate to the primary lecture series. So it's a way to subversively kind of grassroots bring women in and have them then be presence in the school. So these are the posters from the first year. Columbia is the kind of outlier. They always seem to bring people that are really well known, so we're working with them on that. But all the other schools are very accommodating and very interested and willing in doing this. We want to expand beyond New York State, but we thought since we're in New York City, it's the first place we need to start. We have been contacted by other schools outside, which we're now working with them to start their own Architects Brown Bag series or Women in Design series. So this is something we're going to continue and want to expand, but it's a way to empower the students in their representation in the school. So thank you.
Good afternoon. Located on the historic Hollywood Walk of Fame, the Woodbury University Hollywood Outpost provides a forum for the demystification of the discipline of architecture to a diverse audience. The School of Architecture has occupied the 7,500 square foot storefront and studio space for over 20 years. Since 2009, I've acted as director. What follows is a snapshot of some of the more than 75 exhibitions that have been hosted at WUHO in the last 5 years, more than half of which were curated or designed by women. The presentation offers ways in which women can be provided fair exposure. The intention is also to provoke the question, what does it mean to design like a woman? The title of this exhibition says it all. 13.3% is an exasperated reply to those who say there are no women in architecture. 13.3%, of course, refers to the percentage of licensed women architects in the United States in 2010. Co-curators Jana Zweiman and Christian Stainer were overwhelmed by entries that engaged the provocation with tongue-in-cheek challenges of their own. A needlepoint detail of a concrete footing, a brick made of fabric scraps, a photo montage showing 15 Pritzker Prize winners exposed from the waist down. This last entry that briefly graced the WUHO website solicited an angry letter from Zaha Hadid's lawyer. Interpret that as you will. A common theme in many of these exhibitions is hypertactility, material sabotage, and sensory engagement. Irene Chung, Brian Price, and David Gisson's olfactory exhibition featured reconstructions of iconic architecture and built environments. Featuring the work of architects, designers, perfumers who focus on reconstructing historical sense, the exhibition included the smell of Philip Johnson's glass house, Rotterdam Olfactory Object by Aaron Betsky and Herzog and Demeron, and my favorite, the smell of the New Jersey Turnpike. Anya Sorota's Beta Movement was an inhabitable supergraphic that attracted tourists and partygoers off of Hollywood Boulevard. Anya described it as a three-dimensional spectacle that made performative, conspicuous consumption. 2 of the 6 awardees for the Julius Schulman Excellence in Photography Award have featured women photographers. Catherine Opie's work ranges from American urban landscapes, such as her black and white photographs of the Los Angeles freeways, to portraits such as this one on the right of her daughter, in which she studies the relationships between mainstream and infrequent society. Helene Binet's photographs feature the work of contemporary architects from construction through completion, or birth to inception. Helene's WUHO exhibition included photographs of the work of Peter Zumthor, Daniel Liebeskind, and Zaha Hadid. Constructed out of 54 3-foot cubes of white foam, Infrastructural Monument by Anna Neimark reimagines a piece of infrastructure as a monument of a complex history when a canal from Moscow to St. Petersburg was built during the second 5-year plan under Joseph Stalin. By flooding the gallery with water, Jennifer Bonner's Watermarks simulates Venice's Acqua Alta and required gallery visitors to don waterproof booties. The LA Weekly headline for this exhibition was "No Stilettos, Please." So this is an example of young female architects being given a voice and a forum for engaging in their research. And Jennifer Bonner is now at Georgia Tech in Atlanta, and Anna Neimark, formerly at USC, is at SCI-Arc. Authored by German architect Tanja Kulak, the 2011 book Architecture, A Woman's Profession presented conversations with women architects reporting on their academic and professional experiences and their visions for the future. Monica Ponce de Leon, Denise Scott Brown, Regina Leibinger, Jeannie Gang, and others presented positions on the structures, objectives, and content of architecture as practiced by women. Shown here is the symposium at the Mack Center, the Schindler House, that included Margaret Crawford, Dagmar Richter, and Barbara Bester, coinciding with an exhibition at WUHO of the work of the book's collaborators. The upstairs studio at WUHO is host to a fluctuating group of emerging and experimental architects and designers who are also Woodbury faculty members, and provides another rich layer for multidisciplinary, boundary-crossing dialogue and collaboration. In residence since 2013, architect Berenika Boberska hosts workshops and installations in her upstairs office cum studio space. Her work operates at the intersection of building structures, urban prototypes, and personal space, and engages equally with narrative as with new technologies. Her work has been described as enchanting and fantastical. That describes her as well. Stay Down, Champion, Stay Down was the result of our 2009 annual call to adjunct faculty to design an installation at WUHO for $1,000. Designed and built by Molly Hunker and partner Greg Corso, now visiting professors at Syracuse University, this spatial experience with hand-cut terracotta tiles atop transparent acrylic supports continued the surface of the star-studded sidewalk just outside our gallery doors. Violet and aqua lighting highlighted the contrast between the digitally fabricated rods and the hand-cut tiles. Artist Ingrid Lilligren's work also integrates analog making and fabrication through the use of laser-cut and milled molds that create braille script on her hand-tooled ceramic vessels and objects. Cabin Fever is a mock-up of a delaminated wood wallpaper pattern designed as an interior wall surface for a children's camp. The wood flitches were digitally modeled, laser cut, and then promptly misbehaved. In order to achieve the desired effect, Jennifer had to painstakingly iron each flitch individually the night before the opening. Kelly Baer's Rustication Never Sleeps on the right plaster mock-ups were created by laser-cut fabric formwork. She, too, entirely unintentionally ended up with an iron in her hand in order to properly pleat the unruly formwork. And as I mentioned, Jennifer is at Georgia Tech, and Kelly Baer is at the University of Illinois, both former Woodbury faculty members. Deborah Sussman Loves Los Angeles was the first retrospective of the environmental graphic designer's early work, spanning her days at Eames Studio up to the 1984 Olympics. This fierce woman moved beyond the strictures of high modernism with courage, forging an office that began in the 1960s to redefine graphic design. She crossed multiple boundaries, not only those of gender, but also of discipline, with eye-catching work that was a mixture of graphic design, urban planning, architecture, interior architecture, and landscape design. I can think of no more fitting summation to the series of slides that show a body of work by women architects and designers who are operating at the intersection of education and exhibition, and effortlessly and elegantly crossing boundaries while rendering them irrelevant. Thank you.
It's very high speed, and I have to say, from having been involved in looking at the submissions, I understand so much more now about what we premiated and brought here. And though it's very tempting to fall into a conventional Q&A, we really are going to focus on the workshop session here and the charge of the event, interpreting representation as exposure at reviews, lectures, exhibitions. We might add publications, we might add self-representation. I think we could expand this in very concrete ways, and follow Peggy's directive that we should ask ourselves, what can I take home? What can I do? What can I suggest we do? What can I make happen? So the presentations have been offered to serve as a prompt to be able to take home strategies and recommendations that can be utilized in all of our institutions. And again, if anybody isn't interested in now becoming a very active participant in the workshop, I know there's nice things outside that you could go do something else for a while, but we're really hoping to begin by analyzing what each other has done and for suggestions on what you see as take-homes. And we'll capture all sorts of ideas in various modes and see what we can do to work together here, beyond here. I haven't planted any prompts, but if anyone in the panel would like to begin, I invite that. We've spoken first, and it's a way to just prime the pump.
Yeah, I have a question for Lori, actually, in thinking about takeaways and positive strategies. When you did all the analysis of the lecture series, is there a spreadsheet of all of those women who lectured at all of those places that we could then use to make sure they get invited other places?
Yeah.
Right. No. There's this huge spreadsheet, but it's numbers, and so that would be a great thing to start doing, in the future, but it was more just trying to collect the actual numbers themselves. There is, though, I know, a sheet that has been going around of women to be invited to be on reviews, and that's, I've seen that, I've added to that, which is slightly different, but also quite relevant in terms of diversifying review panels. But that would be another column to add to my data collection. It was interesting, though, that it's incredibly difficult to actually get all of this. That's why all the schools aren't represented, that you really either have to dig deeply, and even when we called and emailed, they weren't always very responsive. So we weren't sure how many of them just don't have lecture series versus not really wanting to share, and the history of those are not always online either. So it was surprising. We thought this is a publicizing event for them, so why wouldn't that be so readily accessible? So, but thank you. I'll add a column. Yeah.
I think that's a fabulous idea to circulate, to create that list and circulate it, because our dean is gonna the dean at my school, Pratt, which is, he's much better than this is going to sound, but I went to him the other day, so there were no women on the lecture series, and he said, you're right, it's awful, I just couldn't think of any. Oh. Right, no, sounds terrible, but he's not, he's better than that. But if you had that kind of list and you didn't even ask if people wanted it to be sent to them, if you just sent it, then it would become part of consciousness. So I think it's a fabulous idea.
I mean, part of the issue also, though, is that you'll notice there is a rotation of several. And so one of the goals is to diversify that rotation and bring in new names. But yes, we have to start somewhere.
Yeah, right. Or just create.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just interested in exactly, sorry here. This, Katja Grillner, lecturing next. This question of if we see the list, we would also see the tendency if it's the same women being invited, so it's a kind of one layer of the top, and then how to expand that. So I think that's an interesting part of your research as well, to kind of expose that. Yeah.
Yes.
My area of specialty is building technology, and technology particularly has that problem. So if you look at, for example, Acadia conferences, symposia, it's a ridiculously small number that's represented by women and other underrepresented groups. So I think that's something that we at Woodbury actually are very conscious of and try to do something about.
I just have an observation, and it adds to that. Sorry, I keep losing my voice. Lori and I both teach at the same university, but we don't know each other.
No, I was going to introduce myself afterwards.
I think that raises an interesting question, because we don't know each other because we are in two different disciplines. And although we probably have a lot in common, we haven't found each other in a way. And so I think there's a lot to be said for looking for heroes in other disciplines that can help beef up that number, and to share notes on those kinds of things, because I have a feeling there's a lot of exchange that could happen about thinking about someone who somebody couldn't think of because they don't know about. But it, academia really does keep us in our places, and I think we have to work really hard to get out of those places.
Carol? I was curious, I'm Dale Cohen, and I actually used to teach at Woodbury when they were first accredited. I was part of the team of architects who helped them do that, professors. So it's interesting because I last taught in the late 90s in Los Angeles. And what's depressing, sadly, not having taught since then and have moved to New York since, is that I feel like we've moved, 3 inches. Like I literally could burst into tears in the back of the room. And what's upsetting is that the dean at Pratt, first of all, I don't know how long he's been dean, but he's had a number of clearly female students who've all, probably 20% of them have started practices. So it's not like he didn't ever meet any female students. And so I guess where I sit down is sort of where we begin, right? Where we began, which is how are we still here 40 years later? When I started undergrad at University of Michigan, my dean, Yohe, got up the first day of school and said, we had to accept 50% women in our program. I don't believe women should be architects. That was how I started at 17. And I work in the residential side of the profession, and it is deeply misogynistic. And so I guess my question to everybody here who teaches, why are we still here having this conversation? There should be 50% men in the room too, because clearly part of the problem is that they just find us either annoying, don't think of us, demean us. Not everybody. I mean, that's like a giant, thing. But I went to Yale for graduate school. I think in the 3 years at Yale there were 3 women lecturers, and we have a very hefty program. I don't know how many there are now. I just feel like, we can all talk about this, and it's clearly an issue ongoing. I guess my question is there anything on earth to do about it?
So far, I've taken down these suggestions: gather names, share the lists, look across disciplines, and I think I heard you say, push the deans.
But that brings up a really interesting question, and I mean, Deborah, your comment about Tom, not to pick on him, but the idea, we can do it, he's not here. He's an affable white guy, he won't mind. Is who has, someone said, who has the authority in the Architecture Academy? And I mean, and that's the question, who has the authority in establishing something as very public as a lecture series? And maybe a strategy is to rethink how the lecturers get invited to begin with. Right.
Yeah, our lecture series committee, one of members is here, there's a lot of women on the committee. So, a couple of years ago, Ruth Bader Ginsburg wrote an editorial for the New York Times. I don't know if you saw that, but she lamented the fact exactly that the women's issue had been derailed and had stalled. And she talked about marriage equality, for example, now jumping ahead and really taking on, having a life of its own, obviously supportive of that. But she also talked about her colleagues and the Supreme Court justices, and one of the things she said is that the judges who have daughters tend to seem to be much more open-minded to women's issues. So maybe one of the things on the list is to have more girls.
I have to share just a really brief anecdote. 12 years ago, I taught a course called Race and Gender Constructions in Architecture at Mississippi State. And at the end of the semester in the final exam, I put one of the questions on the test, and it said, name one female architect. And out of 33 students in the class, 7 of them named Faye Jones. And nobody else could name one. I'm sorry, I was interrupting. There was a gal back there.
Hi, I've never taught anywhere. I'm a practitioner from the Organization of Women Architects in San Francisco, and I've been working on this issue for 42 years, and I think there's a lot of hope in this new book, Gender Intelligence, because it talks about the male brain and the female brain, and I don't think we've really thought about that much. And that whole idea is men and women working together and using the science that our brains are really very different, and we need to acknowledge difference. So I hope we can somehow think about that going outside of just architecture and thinking about men and women and how it works and applying it to architecture So if you don't know that book, I would encourage you to have a look.
And I'm going to butt in right now and be the stick in everybody's side. And there's a joke in the black community that says, how do white people keep black people from knowing anything? And the punchline is, they write about it. But this goes back to what Spivak was saying about unlearning your privilege. And I just encourage everyone right now to even if you look around the room, we're a very specific, fabulous looking, uber educated, and I know everybody's struggling to pay their utility bills, but affluent gang here. And and to think about, reading a book that's hard to read, and how are we really going to rock this institution of the architecture profession? It's actually not going to be about a handful of us reading a dense book. I agree with you. We should read that book, but then we gotta, there needs to be more of a revolution here, because it is a desperate situation. To my friend in the back there, when I got invited to this, it really rocked me to the core. I mean, I've been crying too. It's really depressing.
Is this on? Yeah. Okay. So the one thing I do want to stand up a bit for University of Michigan, because we have a female dean and a female chair. But and they all apologized to me. They said, when did you go to school here? I said, in the 80s. They said, we're really sorry. Yeah. So I guess, but I do want to say, in terms of lecture series and so forth, I mean, we actively really work. There are occasions when we accidentally have a man speak or two, and it's a very conscious activity. But I do want to say something else, on top of the who is in charge, who invites people, who's teaching, who are our students. There's who are our alumni boards and trustees, and they are often very male. They come from the school at various times and from other times. And it's interesting to see, we just recently had an alumni board meeting in which we did the diversity statistics in architecture and urban planning, both in the field and in academia, and in particular in our college. And it, in fact, prompted a very interesting conversation, because most of these men never see these statistics. And were quite befuddled by them, and when confronted by them, I think had some really interesting feedback about it. So I think it's not just talking among ourselves and our students and so forth, but the people who fund us, the people who are those generations that came before us, and so on. And I think that's really important as well, because they really do, we forget about them, but they do structure a lot of the life in the place. They provide the donor funds for scholarships. They often fund the lecture series. They do a lot of things, and they also have to be educated on this. We can't just, as one of them pointed out, he finds it very upsetting when he goes to events like this, because he said, well, it's always women talking to other women. I'm a man and I need to learn about these things. So.
My question was related to, some of you spoke about the paradigm of just trying to change how it is. I'm a grad student right now studying architecture, and I just was sort of curious if some of you could speak more to that in terms of the tools that we use and how, obviously I think the education trickles down, and so yes, you might start in a room of similar characters, but then it supposedly trickles down. But I'm sort of curious what the shift in the paradigm is, in your opinion, that needs to happen for women to be, I don't want to say more active, because I think it's a whole shift, but just sort of speaking more about that, if that makes sense.
That was a good question in a Q&A mode, and so I'm going to ask for the answers to be active verbs that we can take home to our own institutions. How do we make a paradigm shift?
Can I offer a partial answer, Carol?
Please.
I'm Deborah. I teach and practice, and I would say I would put on the list constant and granular. And the granularity is not only women, but socioeconomic, race, and ethnicity. Start there. And the granular is that it's great and fantastic, and I loved all these presentations. I, too, was very moved. But it's that lecture series, exhibition, publication. When I say granular, I mean you have final juries and midterm juries, and in between those you have pinups, and in between those you have desk crits. At that level of granularity, there should be diversity in age, background, gender, etc. The universities and colleges, Twitter, tweet, and Instagram, that voice should be young, women, diverse, and granular. I think the idea of the brown bag lunch talk is great so that you don't only have the big lecture that everybody comes to, but the smaller levels of lectures. I think the publications go from Perspecta and the fancy bound ones printed by MIT Press down to things that come out on newsprint that are this long so that maybe not everybody's reading, but they're reading shorter things, 140 characters worth of text. I think the list could be long, but I would argue for the constant and fine-grained granularity of the pressure is the way to bring about the change. And it can't, yes, deans and chairs, yes, lecturers, yes, all of that, but also every day in every way, you're in studio, whether you're practicing, teaching, or being a student, and you have to feel it in the air every minute.
Can I just say one thing? I think that's totally right. And one of the things that, I don't know whether this totally attaches, but one of the things that has struck me in a couple of the talks is working outside of the paradigm as we know it. And part of it with Ingalill, the exhibitions you're showing, part of their effect is that they have a different notion of what architecture is. It's not just building. And so when we're talking about the reviews, we're talking about the lectures, we're talking about the exhibitions, we're talking about publications, I think part of it is really recognizing, for the most part, we all want an expanded net definition of what the discipline actually is that doesn't equal building. And whether that's a more sensuous approach, or whether it's a more craft-oriented approach, or whether that is a more literary approach, I think we need to expand what that definition is and make it visible, because part of what you're showing is that, or shows me, is that people who go to those exhibitions all of a sudden not only learn new names, but they learn a new way of engaging visibly, representationally in the world. So when we go to our exhibitions, when we go to our lectures, I think we should actually think about some other thing besides buildings that allows us to actually have a place in the disciplines.
As the director of the gallery, I have never overtly sought to just select women. But what was interesting when I put the slideshow together, that's when I realized that women are approaching the exhibitions very differently. So I do think that access is, as you said, granular, has to happen all the way through. I think your question is fantastic, actually, so thank you for asking it. And I just wanted to change the subject a little bit to the issue of who's in this audience. And my colleague Mark Neveu is here, and I'm so happy to have him here. But about 3 or 4 years ago now, Amy Murphy was running the ACSA conference, and she asked me to organize a panel on women and technology. And I told her no, but I will do a panel on technology and access. And so I organized the speakers, mostly women, to talk about how technology could become accessible to all demographics. And it was a standing room only. It was an incredibly diverse audience. People from locally Boston also came, which is unusual, I think, for a lot of ACSA sessions. Sheila Kennedy was the primary speaker, Hansa Barraza, Eric Howler from Howler Yoon, and they all talked about how to hack technology, and I would propose that could be one paradigm, to misuse the tools that are given to us, the master's tools, to misuse them, and I think that gets to the second paradigm, which has to do with our students at Woodbury. We're a Hispanic serving institution, and I think it's very grassroots, but there's a very deep desire for social justice. And so bringing the tools to a demographic that doesn't typically have access to those beautiful design, beautiful environments. So I would say that that is another paradigm that interestingly comes from having a diverse student body. So I think just putting that out there.
I just want to add that I think some of the things we're still talking about seem intimidating because we're still talking about individual recognition in a publication, an exhibit, a whatever it is, a lecture, right? So I ask, is there other forms? Is there other things? Can we value conversations? Can we value things at a different level? Because those are quite intimidating categories. Maybe not so much to us, but to many people they are. I mean, and so I think we have to rethink about maybe some of those things that we could do. I'm also really struck by the comment that was made that your boss felt uncomfortable coming to a conference like this because it was in a group full of women. What is that causes that discomfort? Because I don't think any of us going to a conference with a bunch of guys are going to be that uncomfortable, right? There's something there that needs to be taken a look at. And that's why I go back to things like conversation, face-to-face, dialogue as a mode to get over some of those things. Because that's a real a roadblock for us, I think, that's still there. It still exists, and there's a real discomfort about gender. Still. Don't know the solution, but.
I also wanted to address this question of changing the paradigm. And my name's Andrea. My work is on feminism and architecture in the 70s and 80s. And I think one of the things that allowed for the massive change that happened in that period that we're still benefiting from was that it wasn't just a discussion that was happening within architecture, within the design disciplines. It was a major social movement that women in architecture were able to plug into and to engage with. And I think we need to expand our dialogue beyond just, what's happening in our disciplines to try to address some of the larger issues in society. And I think that's something that if we can, create a momentum, not just within our disciplines, but to be part of a larger movement, I think that's where the change is going to come. And it's happening. I mean, if you look at the discourse that's happening in the media and happening in politics, so how do we, in our fields, plug into that?
I think that that's actually right on point as to what I want to say. There's a few things out here. The first thing, who plans these conferences? It was my understanding and my witness that I see that a lot of the students do it. And that's something that the Ivy League is not getting Ivy League students, that the first thing you do in your sophomore year is whatever field you're in, you go out, you pick up the phone, and you invite your favorite person over to talk, and you buy some food, and by graduation day, you have a job. I mean, I don't understand how Ivy League students don't know this. They really don't. I don't know what's going on in there. So I would say that the students do it. Are you really reaching out and talking to young women? The second thing is men don't sit around thinking about how they're going to engage with women. I mean, there's just too much focus on this. What you should be doing is thinking about what you can do. First of all, no one cares about architecture. Whether you're a man or a woman, the chances of erecting anything these days in New York City, for instance, is less than nil. What you should be doing is, I know that I look dumb, okay, but maybe you should be talking to someone like me who might want to erect a brownstone that's big enough to go into, small enough to fit in the gallery, that recreates my teenage room that I had to run away from because 40 years ago, the same McDonald's, the same Erasmus Hall had the same scene that we saw in the papers, and I had to run away with Bruce Springsteen. So it's not just you who have not gone anywhere in 40 years. Nothing in education has gone anywhere in 40 years. It's gone backwards. Advertising. Advertising, gimmicks, business. I mean, the lipstick building was fine, but the glass house was also very interesting for Philip Johnson. Why don't you come up, forget about all of that, and really, you know, one, help another artistic person to get a grant, so you both can get grants to do something. I mean, you know, I engage with people like Merce Cunningham. You had Buckminster Fuller. He was a mathematician. You had Morris Graves. He was a painter. Merce Cunningham was a dancer. And John Cage was whatever. You know, they all didn't come from the same discipline. Stop thinking about men and get out and do something. No one cares about architecture. I bet that if you did something totally out of it, this is how you get your fame to claim in your field. It's called business, advertising.
Well, one of the things that I was thinking about in the very beginning discussion about sharing these lists and the names, for the lecture series, I recently realized that some people actually solicit invitations and, you know, write up I'm willing and available to lecture, here's a preview of what my lecture would be, send them all out to the deans, and get themselves then on a short list or some potential lecture. And this is something that had just never occurred to me, that you might self-advertise your availability to give a lecture. And I don't know how many people in this room have ever done that or thought of doing that as a way, if you have a good lecture, it's prepared, and you sit around waiting for the invitation to come in your email box, it's never gonna come. So maybe that's another strategy there, is blatant self-promotion.
Not a bad one.
I'll prime the pump. Change the paradigm. I really like this, that we're working on strategies to utilize to take home to change the paradigm. When I was young, I thought about revolution, and now I think about just stop replicating the way that it's always been. I don't know if that's very affirmative. It's okay. Stop self-replication. Now, it's a great discussion, and I'm doing my best to pull out the exact words, but I would really ask, may I get some ideas about this really great comment about engaging other realms, because I think it connects to the comments about helping others. And I personally think this is where we gotta look. I think this is where we really have to start working again. I was so thrilled to be alive in the 70s, and my mom was a union member in the 50s, and after each one of her kids, she had 6 months off for childcare. And I thought, oh, the world's gonna be better for me. I had no idea how there's wheels inside wheels, and what looked like in the 70s something that was just going to be so much better, and it's hardly budged, though. Karen, you're so nice to show us it has budged. I think that architects would do really well, women and all the human beings, to bombard this with more active verbs. Can I ask for that? Does that make sense here?
I mean, just to say, I think that relates to the last comment over here, which is that as we can talk about getting more representation within the discipline as it is, or we can really change the discipline as it is, so that we are actually players in it. And I think it's a two-way street, which is that if we open it up and see it in a more politically, socially engaged way, more of us would actually surface, i.e. we would be visible because that category includes most of us. But I also think that it then presents a forum for architecture to show itself off to the rest of the world, such that when we when that relevance enters into the newspapers or the political scenes or decisions that are made about the environment or whatever those places that we should be that we're currently not, it would drag all of us who are interested into visibility. So it works both ways. It would be a larger net, and that net would be more visible to the rest of the world. I think it's important.
I want to support some of that as well and just say that I guess I have a very practical mind in a way, but if I look at all the things that you've written down in the wonderful presentations here, I really feel that there's a need for an enormous network, but it could be a web-based network in which the people who are working in the same university can through, I mean, technology is amazing in this way, can bring together people just by searches and accomplishments and lectures or interest groups or whatever. And I just was visiting this website recently about metaphors in literature, and it was such an amazing website that you could think about different texts in the history of literature in a completely different way. And this is a huge project to do. It would need a large grant, but people would probably, there are probably ways to do it. I just feel like all of those, or many of those issues we've brought up, could be infused in a very deep and interesting network that people could use in academia, across disciplines, all the work, all the research that you've done, Lori. It's just how, if I take away something from this moment, that's what I would take away, and the question is how can that get done? It's a huge amount of work. Having done a website recently, it's an interactive one, but I really think there's a potential in that to do many of the things that people are asking to do here.
So, Peggy, I think if we're, especially if we're trying to put those two columns together too, the engage the social political means and help people who are ourselves and other people, I think there are paradigms that already exist that are certainly have been inspiring to me. And they tend to be in planning schools. And they tend to be particularly in community planning schools that focus on community-based planning, and they're interdisciplinary. They are very porous, as the between academia and the world. That they organize the world, but they organize the relationship of the design discipline to the world through what they do. And I think it's a wonderful paradigm. And I think there is, to some extent, they don't engage architecture proper enough, maybe because I don't think you can blame one or the other, but I think it's an untapped fountain of ways of starting to design in the world in a different way.
Hi, everybody. I think this has been a great discussion. I'm delighted to be here, and goodness knows I believe in the power of women's networks. It's a long and tried true method of organization that those who've studied the history of women in the United States know has existed for some time. But I'm really dubious about the power of it to change the condition in architecture schools simply on its own. And I think to the great presentations about unlearning privilege and also about questioning whether one can use, how one both engages with and claims the master's tool to claim the master's house. And in my experience, what one has to do to succeed in making the issues come to the fore in architecture schools is to step outside of architecture schools and engage the power structures of universities and build allies and networks with deans and provosts and presidents and committees on inclusion and excellence and all the rest of it and on diversity, but also to make it clear that within the power structure of the university there are people backing the demands for this kind of fine-grained, granular granular integration of gender and all sorts of other issues of inclusion that are critical for the ideas to succeed. It is a hard, arduous, and never-ending battle. It doesn't stop. So, you know.
I know we're on representation, but I think one of the things this has led me to think about, not just today, but for a while, is the issue of our curricula. And I think that's a critical issue in terms of doing what you're putting forward and to rethink the way this works, is that we have to rethink the way we educate people and what does architectural education look like. So I don't want to jump to tomorrow, but I think for me that's critical in all of these issues is what is relevant now for education for architects, especially if we want to think about engaging social and political issues and really expanding far outside any kind of normative boundaries of what is architecture and what is creative spatial practice. So I think I'm all for trying to define differently architectural education.
One of the things that Peggy referred to was the fact that so many of those women are working outside of the traditional boundaries, and one of the of architecture. And one of the projects that we're working on at our university is the integrated alternative path to licensure. And Mark is one of the co-authors of that, and that is really looking. It's really integrating licensure into the academy, but very much the sort of undercurrent of our interest has to do with really opening up in making sure that everybody who wants to be licensed will be. So it's really, opening up the pipeline, as they call it, which talks about economic limitations. The other issue I wanted to, or example I wanted to give is some of our colleagues started an institute, the Arid Land Institute. Peter and Hadley Arnold are co-directors of that institute. And while they're both architects, they engage the political conversation. And they're looking at drought and water resources, but working with city organizations, the Department of Water and Power and the Mayor's Council in Los Angeles. And so they are, and it's getting, I think, to some of the comments from the person who was speaking in the back, really looking at how can architecture become relevant to a larger population. And I think that these institutes, and I hope you'll look at a lot of them. We have a lot of really exciting institutes at Woodbury, Architecture and Civic Engagement, for example. But Arid Land Institute is one example of engaging outside of those traditional boundaries of architecture and trying to introduce the benefit that architects and the synthetic thinking that we have to a larger questions in the world.
But it occurs to me too that one response to that is to kind of come back to a little navel gazing, since we're here talking about architecture in the academy. And it's easy as someone who is a tenured member of an architecture faculty to speculate about all kinds of different ways of working and different ways of networking. But I wonder if, and this goes back to what you were saying about valuing conversations, how do we change the nature of peer review in order to, say, make work that would normally be considered, merely advocacy or merely a contribution to the discipline? How do you make that valuable as part of the scholarship that someone is doing? And I think that's a challenge once one is a member of the academy, to think about what happens to the next generation in the academy. Even if we assume that tenure is eventually disappearing, there are going to be things that replace it. Evaluation will always happen. Peer review will always happen. So it seems to me that there's just that somehow that needs to be added to our changing the paradigm is also about scrutinizing the paradigms of tenure and review.
And that language, the language of it. I also want to add that being a dean or having a woman in a position of, quote, power as we recognize it, for example, as a dean, from my experience, I would say it's often a position of negotiation. It's not a position of power. And we really need everybody to help those people. They can't do it on their own, because being in that position doesn't necessarily mean you can do anything, quite frankly. And so I think it's important to have those outsiders, pushing. And I think Don't underestimate the voice of your students, because if they're engaged and committed, what they say, particularly in an academic institution, really, really can be very, very powerful. So I don't know if everybody saw our sit-in at Syracuse University over last winter. Very, very powerful stuff. So.
One of the things that lingers in my head about different tactics to let a younger generation publish and understand what that is links to Gabrielle, how you went it is like, fuck yes, feminism. The term feminism and the, on the one hand, the fear that I think a younger generation has of identifying as feminist, and also stories that I've heard of people whose dissertations were not approved or who did not get positions because they came into the discipline as having identified themselves as doing women's work or doing feminist work or doing gender work, and that does not help in any of the advancement opportunities. So I'm curious to hear thoughts about how useful it is to identify that way or use that term, or whether in some way there's a kind of an agreement that we all know what we're talking about. We don't have to use a controversial word. I'm anxious to hear thoughts about that.
Hermione Granger gave a great video. You can find it online, where she said, "I don't care what you call it. I just think women should be considered equal to men."
He for she.
I appreciate and understand your comment completely, and I think there is a sea change happening now, and it has happened in the past 2 or 3 or 4 years, and I can't quite, 2 or 3 or perhaps even more recently, I can't quite figure it out, why it is that all of a sudden it is okay yet now to say yes, that you are a feminist. And it's at City College, maybe, come uptown. But it's also at the Graduate Center too. So I am very pleased to find that my colleagues in art history are all talking about feminism, about gender, and about women, and also about sexuality, which we can't eliminate from this discussion too. I think I can't figure it quite out, but I did ask one of my younger colleagues about this question, and she said, well, it's because we're all starting to come of age. We're all starting to hit practice. We're starting to think about families. We're starting to face the issues that you faced when you did this work too. And I thought, well, that's interesting, but there's about 30 or 40 years in between those two phases where that somehow seemed to disappear from the conversation. So I am actually really optimistic. And I just want to make my point clearer, the one that didn't get up on the board. And one is that women don't talk about power. Women don't talk about money. Women have to do that. And also, architecture schools think that architecture schools can solve their problems within themselves. And in the past 2 years, I've become very involved in governance at City College. I have hit a wall of sexism that I could not believe in that action. But what it has taught me is how important it is for architecture schools to engage in the larger college community if architecture schools want to change, and that women need to lead that avant-garde. So please do this. It's critical. And there are allies, absolutely, allies who want to work with women in architecture in the larger community to make this stuff happen. It isn't only that architecture schools have to build allegiances and networks outside of the school to the profession. That's important, surely. But architecture schools sit within institutions, and the policies and actions and activities of that institution can be put to good use for change within architecture schools. And this is something that this is about power, and it needs to be enacted.
I don't have to say that twice, but I completely agree with that perspective. You can't get anything done without that negotiation and without developing partnerships outside of the school. It's really important.
And pressure. And since women do most of the service, right, women should be leading this all.
to say that I'm happy to hear that for New York City, but in the flyover states where some of us work, the backlash to saying you're a feminist is deadly. And I've been a victim of it, and I'm out of architecture because of it. I think we have to be careful. And a lot of people in sociology who study feminists and sociology, who study third wave feminists, see that young women think, well, we're all equal now, so it's okay to be sexy and focus on our appearance, and we have it all. So young women, especially middle class women, have to get great grades, be great at sports, and great looking. They have to do it all, as if appearance is who they are. So there's a lot of research being done on that now, and maybe in New York it's one thing, but I'll tell you, the rest of the world, it's deadly, unfortunately. And that stopped conversation. Yay me.
I would just like to share this, inspired by the conference, of this conference last year. We in the Organization of Women Architects held a meeting called Feminism and Architecture, and I started the conversation out with, how do you measure yourself on a scale of 1 to 10 for feminism? That was our introduction around the room. And so it was very interesting whether you were a 5 or a 4 or 8 or a 3, but at the end, a lot of the young women said, well, maybe I'm different. You know, at the end of a group discussion, they changed their ability to speak about feminism. This is San Francisco. I agree, it might be a little different than flyover. But some of the young women said, I don't want to use the word feminism because my mother fought so hard, I don't want to do that. So there are a lot of social issues to feminism, and I really think we do have to talk feminism half the time of this conference because it's feminism and architecture, and we have to apply it to architecture badly.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 more comments. We're going to end a little bit early for the time of the day.
I think it's interesting that we're talking about reaching out to other fields and other disciplines, and we're not talking about reaching out to our own discipline, to women in practice. And I think it's a very complicated question about women's role in academia, but I think it's even more complicated when you look at practice and you look at the way that corporate practice in particular is evolving. I think women are increasingly marginalized. I realize that was last year's conference that I didn't attend, but I don't think we can really separate these two issues. As we know, they're often marginalized into non-creative project management and project administrative roles. And when you are in academia and you're reaching out to the profession to find women, it's often like trying to ride a seesaw alone. There's just nobody there to reach out to, or very few relative to our male colleagues. So I think we have to be very careful when we say things like architecture is not just building. I'm actually at a place in my own career and practice where I'm starting to believe more and more that maybe it is just building, and that we should not be ceding territory and walking away from what is the core of our discipline as a means to find expression and acceptance. So.
One last comment? I mean, directive?
Have some coffee.
There isn't one more? All right.
That might be it.
I think that both in representation and in every social political realm that the United States should have a federal family leave policy. We're the only advanced industrialized nation in the world without one. And if that doesn't represent us, representation doesn't stand for much. I think also that we should all support more women, including architects, to run for political office.
Yes,
and,
that's a great
got my 2 up.
Vote for me.
All right, thank you very much, everybody, and we'll take a break.
Thank you.